It begins with recognizing the deep inequities that live among us. By making visible the invisible and bridging these vast divides, it sparks determination, not pity. It demands challenging the status quo, the courage to take paths less traveled, and the willingness to immerse in the shared truths of our vulnerabilities. It makes philanthropy work for communities, not for privilege. It calls for nurturing trust and radical kindness, the empathy to explore possibilities, and the humility to accept these in our oneness. It's the fierce ambition to be uncompromising, to satiate the hunger for learning, and to have the audacity to amplify the most vulnerable of voices. It requires perseverance, intelligence, and gusto, true moral courage for sustenance. It inspires leadership that adjusts the sails to catch the wind, to imagine possibilities in pursuit of a higher purpose, bigger than ourselves, but that together is surmountable. Dasra, it combines the power of the mind and the courage of the heart to tackle large-scale inequities, building an India that we all deserve, thriving with dignity and equity.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Dasra Philanthropy Week 2023. We are glad to have you all join us today. Dasra Philanthropy Week is currently in its 14th edition, and it has always stood as a platform to bring together diverse stakeholders and voices from the development ecosystem to convene, converse, and continue sustained action towards the quest for 1 billion Indians to thrive with dignity and equity. We are delighted to share that this edition is hosting 40 plus sessions across diverse themes, hear voices of 100 plus thought leaders, and have more than 2,000 plus attendees tune in for both our in-person and virtual events. This is the most extensive spread of programming we've ever had at DPW, and are excited for a lineup of thought-provoking sessions we have lined up for you today. Welcome to the session, The Evolution of Rupee for Rupee Philanthropy in India. This session is being held in partnership with Satwa, and it is my pleasure to now hand it over to Ananta from Satwa. Over to you, Ananta.
Hey, thank you so much, Prachi, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ananta Narayan. I'm an advisor and part of the leadership team at Satwa Consulting and the Satwa Knowledge Institute. And before moving on to the impact sector, I spent about 25 years in investment banks, largely Morgan Stanley and Credit Suisse. And I think like many of you all here, I did a sort of a reverse Anakin Skywalker, moved from the dark side to the right side. But it's great to have all of you here. So thank you for participating, and a big thank you to Dasra for organizing such a wonderful event. So essentially, the topic that we'll be exploring today is on how to make Rupee philanthropy more efficient. So it's well-known fact that USD philanthropy is now being replaced by Rupee philanthropy, which essentially means that it is important to make it more efficient, to leverage the Rupee philanthropy as much as possible. And some of the ways of doing this is through blended finance and through more sort of impactful investing. There's a lot of jargon doing the rounds as far as this topic is concerned. Our endeavor today will be to demystify some of this. And we have a wonderful sort of panel with us. And some of the topics that we wish to, some of the questions that we wish to answer are around what are some of the prerequisites needed by both the donors as well as by the grassroots organizations. What are the different types of instruments that can be used? Some of the ancillary features. We'll briefly touch upon social stock exchanges and the role that they can play. And we'll conclude by having some thoughts on what really need to change to make this even more effective. But before getting on to the panel, my colleague Lekya Reddy is going to make a brief 10 to 15-minute presentation. This will cover some of the basics and essentially set the context for us to continue with our discussion. Lekia she anchors the Capital for Impact practice at the Satwa Knowledge Institute. She spent a significant amount of time interacting with CSR donors, with philanthropic donors, both domestic and multinational, and various aspects of impactful giving. And with this, I'll hand it over to you, Lekia.
Thank you so much, Ananta. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much to all the speakers for taking out the time, and and really looking forward to your perspectives, from your experience, and thanks to all the participants here as well, who are here to just listen in. During the course of the presentation, if any of you have any questions, feel free to drop them on the chat box. If you wish to remain anonymous, you can just directly message me as well. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Dasra team, if you could just quickly confirm, if you're able to see my screen, that'd be helpful. All right, just checking in. If all of you are able to see my screen, Ananta, if you could quickly confirm, please.
Yes.
Perfect. All right. I would start by actually talking about the journey that we are going through of reimagining the role of philanthropy in India. As we all know, the civil society and the for-profits in India are working tirelessly towards bringing about transformational change, as we all know. But where the growth and the opportunities are also fairly distributed, right, among the communities and the regions. Simultaneously, we're also seeing a rapid growth of the philanthropic community itself, both in the terms of increase in the private sector funding, the sort of figure that you're seeing over here, which is almost 63K crore. And also in terms of the diversification in the instruments, the approaches and the practices of philanthropy itself. We're seeing increasing number of organizations also investing in high-need underserved areas, and this is also geographically
sorry, Lekia, I don't think the slides are moving ahead.
Oh, we're just on the slide, Ananta. I'm just providing a quick voiceover. Yes. But we're also seeing, increased sort of organizations, working in high-need underserved areas geographically and sectorally by making their giving more outcome and impact-oriented as well. And over the last 2 years, the pandemic has also triggered a rise in collaboration among civil society, funders, and the government. But also, and this is where the sort of the numbers on these slides come in as well, is, we're witnessing an increased trend where organizations are seeking more structured and informed giving and engaging in newer forms of social and impact investments as well, right? Like such as retail funding, which is, funding from folks like you and I, venture philanthropy, but also sustainable, innovative financing solutions that is appealing to those who keen to sort of tap into multiple sources of capital in order to finance the social impact ecosystem over the long term, which is also why we saw almost 220 for-profit enterprises seeing almost 13K crore capital investments, of which almost 906 crores, just went into the impact sector itself. And to move forward, this is just based on Satwa's experience of working with CSRs and the philanthropic foundations. We have seen the approach to philanthropy itself, has evolved, and to be more, in a more catalytic manner, it's being looked at, from three lenses. One, the nature of the capital itself and the type of instruments that one's using to direct this capital towards the problems and the needs in the sector. And lastly, interestingly, when the capital should be deployed as well, right? Through the journey of the problem itself. And moving forward, if I were to spend some time looking at the problem to be solved, this is what we call as Donella Meadows system change framework, wherein we try to see the various leverage points that an organization can make in a system. And with, in the past, almost 90% of the funding was going to improving capacity and capabilities of individuals and organizations. But over the past couple of years, there's been increased funding towards the other systemic levers that you can see over here, such as pathways, such as using platforms, public tools, and technology, as well as improving, funding policies, governance institutions, and to strengthen them and incentivize a level playing field. but also interestingly looking at changing the leadership mindset through creation of commons, through events, etc., and to create a paradigm shift in the ecosystem. This is where the efforts are increasingly being headed towards. Moving on to when the capital is being deployed, right? And
No,
Lekha,
I'm sorry. I don't know whether it is just me. I can still see the cover slide.
Yeah, me too.
Oops. Okay.
Can you just check once?
Yes. Guess it's my bad. Yes. Are you all able to see my slide now?
Yeah, we can see a tab, so you can make it full screen.
Sure. Sure. I hope you're able to see slide 7 as of now.
We can, Lekha, although it's not full screen, but yeah, we can see it.
Okay. All right. How about now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I'm so sorry for that technical error. But also looking at when this capital is being deployed, right? We're noticing how the philanthropic capital is being deployed, considering the stage of the problem itself and how early the mainstream market players can start playing a role in the life cycle of the problem and the impact. And here we can see how philanthropic grant sort of comes in when the mainstream and the private market play and the government plays quite low towards the problem, and they fill in that viability gap to prove the model. And that's where instruments like venture debt, blended finance also come in. And eventually, when the mainstream market play and the government play sort of gets stronger, since the model is already proven, that's where philanthropy seems to exit. But also moving forward to the nature of the capital itself that is being deployed to these problems, we're seeing how, depending on the market response and depending on the state response itself towards problem, where the ecosystem is not sure whether the problem in itself is a market failure and the state failure. That's where seed fund comes in. And if we were to look at the evolution of the problem itself, seed fund, wherein organizations are increasingly supporting bold entrepreneurs to begin developing an idea or a new product or service. But in the next stage, where market needs viability and the state needs to understand whether the sort of solution can be implemented or not, the venture debt sort of come into play, wherein loans are provided to an early stage company, which also serves as a strategic tool to complement the equity financing. And mostly the pilots, etc., are conducted at the stage in a certain geography, in a certain small scale location, so that the proof of concept is established. And lastly, when the state is seeing viability, of the solution itself, and they are then providing implementation abilities to philanthropy, and the market also sees and seeks incentives to work on this and to work with the populations facing this problem. And that's why blended finance sort of comes in the strategic use of the developmental and the capital finance to mobilize the additional finance towards the issues. And as part of blended finance, it attracts the commercial capital towards the ideas that contribute to the sustainable development, while also providing financial returns to investors. And additionally, if we were to look at state response as well, state sees viability and gives their implementation abilities like I just spoke about. While at the same time, the risk is sort of shared among the philanthropic players, among the state players and the market players. I know we've been talking about blended finance quite often, on all these slides so far. So I'm just going to spend some time unpacking and understanding blended finance for some of the folks here who are new to this. I would say blended finance in very simpler terms. It's where a primary investor, a private investor who sort of invests capital with an aim to earn some sort of financial returns, while a public or a philanthropic capital is willing to absorb the risks of their developmental investments. And this is where, this is because the mainstream market capital has a huge potential to bridge the investment gap. However, a lot of times these private investors do appear reluctant owing to certain risks, which the philanthropic players sort of absorb. And these risks and the sort of reluctancy among private sector participation could be because of multiple factors, such as limited knowledge in the markets, unfamiliarity with the development sector, challenging investment climates, and potentially low returns and limited incentives. But through blended finance models, philanthropic and government capital can be used to enable the development investments be more attractive to private investors, wherein there are three types of returns in that case. So one, financial returns for the sort of private players, sort of environmental and social returns, as well as developmental returns for philanthropic players. But at the same time, we're able to establish the proof of the intervention. We're able to understand what models work, what do not, and sort of absorb the risks of the investment itself. But if we were to also spend some time on why blended finance and not others, if we were to look at all the sort of the approach to funding itself on a continuum, and considering sort of three parameters, which is financial returns, environmental and social returns, as well as developmental returns, blended finance is able to meet all these three types of sort of returns, for the various stakeholders involved. And which is why blended finance has that potential to channelize philanthropic as well as commercial capital while benefiting all the stakeholders involved. The other sort of advantages is, while of course, one, it de-risks the investments. Second, it is also increasing the leverage through efficient use of capital, because one is able to recycle the capital or unlock further private and commercial capital, which could also help as multiplier effect in scaling social impact. Lastly, it also enables effective collaboration. We've been talking a lot about collaboration as part of the Dasra Philanthropy Week as well. And through this blended finance models, there's a huge scope for different stakeholders in the ecosystem coming together, one bringing in funding, the other bringing in expertise, but all the different players sort of playing complementary roles. Spending some time on the various instruments itself, this could get slightly complicated because almost 14 plus blended finance instruments that exist. But I would like to touch upon the most prominent ones that are being favorably used and how. One is to provide concessional capital, and this is in the form of a private equity or a debt by a public or a philanthropic fund. And this is mainly to provide incentives to the private players. This could be of two types. It could be first loss capital, or it could be with a guarantee. And concessional capital is generally provided when the support, when there are poor investment fundamentals in the markets, as well as when innovation on products and sort of services is required to overall reduce the cost of project and providing protection itself to private investors. The second is what we call risk underwriting, and this is again by providing guarantee, also in some cases insurance, which is generally provided below market terms. And this also helps in increasing the credit profile of the project itself to help them raise more and cheaper capital. And the third one, which all of us must be familiar with, is a technical assistance. And this is mainly to build the capacity of the investments to achieve expected financial, social, and developmental returns. And this is primarily done by providing grants that are leveraged pre or post the investment to enhance the sort of viability of the project. And this could also be used to provide advisory services, research, operational assistance, training, and other sort of services to enhance the performance of the investment itself. Lastly is the direct funding, which while doesn't look like blended finance, but it's actually design grant, which is providing these grants to design a project or to design an intervention. And the costs such as conducting feasibility studies, conducting due diligence studies, etc., which have a large upfront cost, can be absorbed. While we have so far spoken about the change in philanthropy in India, the need for blended finance models, also briefly touching upon the emerging models as well, which is social stock exchange. With recently NSE getting the final SEBI approval, right, to launch it, and which was way back first mooted in 2019-20 to enable, and what the amazing thing about this is it will enable entities involved in social activities, both nonprofits and for-profits, to access the capital market for funds, which includes CSRs, philanthropic foundations, mainstream market players, as well as retail givers, everyday givers like you and me. And there are various instruments again for nonprofits and for-profits. Maybe I'll just spend 2 minutes talking about quickly those instruments.
Lekhya, you're on mute. If you can unmute yourself.
Did I just go on mute?
Yeah, just for the last second.
Great. Till where could you hear me?
We heard you till just about a second back, Lekya.
Okay, perfect. I guess someone had muted me accidentally, no worries. Just talking about the various instruments that are available for nonprofits and for-profits. For nonprofits, there are mainly 3 kinds of instruments that are currently being suggested. One is ZCZB, which is what we call as zero principal and zero coupon bonds. And to simplify this again, it will allow nonprofits to directly list in the social stock exchange and unlock funds from diverse, funders like donors, philanthropic foundations, and CSRs. And they would be written off the investors' books at the end of the tenure itself. Second is the mutual funds, and these units could again be redeemable in principal terms, but all the returns could be channelized towards the chosen nonprofits by this fund that would act as an intermediary. The last one is pay for success bonds, which we must have heard as social impact bonds or developmental impact bonds, which is through lending partners or through grants that could be effective to ensure a more efficient and accountable deployment of capital. For-profits as well, we have equity and secondly, very interestingly, social venture funds, which would consist of various investment funds being pooled together, which can then be used in investing private equity. They already exist for for-profits, but do not currently require social impact reporting, which takes me to the next point and my last sort of section of the presentation itself, is when we already have various ways to sort of channelize funding towards nonprofits and for-profits. The advantage of social stock exchange in itself is one, the common reporting standards, because currently every nonprofit, every for-profit has their own way of reporting these impact numbers, etc. So social stock exchange would have very sort of standardized indicators and standardized questions that will help form those common reporting standards. Second, it would be a very sort of transparent platform with diverse fundraising avenues for nonprofits and for-profits. Third is the visibility. Since all the nonprofits and for-profits would be on the same platform, it's definitely going to enhance the visibility of the organizations. Fourth is, like we've been talking about, the capital availability itself. Given there are going to be diverse forms of capital flowing into the platform, it will help unlock greater capital, which is available for social impact funding, and in fact, amplify the 64K crore that we're talking about much further. And lastly, which is what this panel discussion is all about as well, it will help us institutionalize the innovative fundraising instruments that I briefly spoke about before as well. It will help us institutionalize those through social stock exchange and also increase awareness about those fundraising instruments too. So yes, that's a quick presentation and overview of how philanthropy has evolved, rupee to rupee over the past few years, how innovative fundraising instruments have been looked into, and lastly, what are some of the emerging models like social stock exchange. Over to you, Ananta. I can see some questions on the chat, I guess. I'll just answer those questions in the chat box itself.
Thank you so much, Lekhya, for that great way to set the context. And apologies for the technical glitch at the beginning, but if you all have any questions to ask Lekhya, please do put it in the chat box. She'll happily answer that. And also, if you have any questions for the panelists as we go along the discussion, please do put that in and we'll take it up right at the end. So now with that presentation out of the way, let's move on to this wonderful panel that we have. And we have a panel that represents both the funders and the grassroots organizations. I'll just do a brief introduction, moving in alphabetical order. Dipesh is the co-founder and CEO of Enable India. It's an award-winning nonprofit organization that works for the economic independence and dignity of people with disability across India. He brings about 20 years of experience in software and setting up offshore companies. He's an electronics engineer and has a Master of Science in Computer Science. I realize it's a busy period for you, Dipesh, given your recent travels and the pains of moving houses. So thank you for battling all that and being here for us. Moving on to Lakshmi, she's the director at Midya Network India. She leads frontier investments in financial inclusion, education and employability, and agri. She has close to 2 decades of experience across both the corporate and the development sector, and she was more recently with the Nudge Institute. She has an MBA from ISB and is a chartered accountant. And I know you're battling a bad throat, so again, thank you for being here despite that. Dr. Sarika Kulkarni is the founder of RA Foundation, which has successfully addressed grassroots poverty and has made the life better for a lot of underprivileged communities in Maharashtra. She was in academics for many years, teaching at leading business schools besides writing papers and books. Then she became an entrepreneur and eventually founded RA. She has a Master of Science and a PhD. Additionally, she also has a bunch of other degrees and certificates, but I think we'll run out of time if I go through all of that, so I'm just going to skip that. Thank you for being here, Sarika. And finally, Soumya is director at 361 Foundation. This was incidentally formerly called as IIFL Wealth and Asset Management. She has 25 years of experience with multinational foundations and family offices and has built a wonderful career in corporate sustainability and philanthropy. She has co-authored a report on catalytic CSR, which I think is a fantastic read, by the way. So you could Google for it and look it up. Thank you for being here, Soumya. So I think, so one thing I think is fairly clear is that there is actually a need, the debate about Rupee philanthropy taking over is actually absent, but there is a need to make it more effective. And I wanted to use the wisdom and the knowledge of these panelists in addressing 3 or 4 questions during the session. In the first part, I just wanted to put some slight perspective as to how do people get prepared for this? How do donors get prepared, and how do grassroots organizations get prepared? In the second one, we'll dive into some specific blended finance instruments. Lekia spoke about a lot of instruments, but we'll get to some of the ones that really work well in the Indian context. And in the third part, I'll just tackle some of the adjacent issues around this area. So with this background, let me just ask you the first question, Lakshmi. You actually, in a way, straddle the entire spectrum of Rupee philanthropy in India. And it'll be useful to get your experience about the dual checkbook experience, approach, as you call it. And also, what do you think are the key differences in a catalytic approach versus the more traditional ways? What are the key things to keep in mind, and what works best under what situation?
Sure. Thanks, Ananta. Let me just kind of elaborate a little bit on what a dual checkbook approach means, and then jump off into some examples that might help others understand this. So at ONI, I think we use a dual checkbook approach basically to ensure that we have flexibility of deploying capital to support entrepreneurs who are building a more meaningful life for the next 500 million, which is our stated target group. And by that, what we mean is that we will support bold entrepreneurs, be it from the private sector, be it from the public sector, or from the nonprofit sector. And this may be by either investing in startups for equity returns, or it may be by supporting development of market infrastructure, by supporting innovative financial instruments. It could be by supporting researches or surveys that can spotlight the gaps in solutions and then catalyze capital or innovation or talent to be applied to those problems. It could be by funding lighthouse projects that can have a demonstration effect. But that all sounds like a lot of jargon, right? Like, for example, education is an area that ONI has been deeply committed to. We are committed to improving access to quality education and improving learning outcomes for children and youth in the next 500 million. So by using a dual checkbook approach, what we're able to do is we're able to invest in, let's say, tech startups like Vedantu or Doubtnut. We've also in the past funded organizations like TFI, which are building capacity for teachers and leaders in the education space. We're currently working with education initiatives, which is in turn working with the CBSE board to reform the board exam system and help shift the focus from rote-based learning to competency-based assessments, which we believe will then cascade down to having more focus on competency-based learning for students across the board. A dual checkbook approach also means that as equity investors, we deeply believe in the power of tech for good, that technology will be able to solve for access to quality education, healthcare, mobility solutions, etc. But also, we also believe that access to tech can increase vulnerabilities and expose populations to harms, which we would like to counter by investing in responsible tech. And so what does that mean? It means supporting efforts in responsible tech, which can help governments or businesses or consumers adopt practices and behaviors that can promote data security, privacy, consent, control over your own data. And we've done this by funding development of playbooks that can help others learn how they can have better data practices, privacy, or governance systems. So those are some examples. We could, in research, we would, for example, support research studies that can help entrepreneurs understand their customers better. So, for example, a state of Aadhaar report that we funded provided insights on what is the unfinished agenda for Aadhaar in India. A currency of trust report that we funded helps improve understanding among different entrepreneurs on what are the barriers that low-income households face in accessing financial services. There have been research that we funded which has helped policymakers in making the right decisions. So, be it the RBI's technical committee on household finance, which was, which referred to some of the data that we had generated from a research and survey we had conducted. So, that's what we mean by dual checkbook approach. It's basically the having the option to optimally deploy capital in multiple ways, so that you can create impact by either supporting entrepreneurs or building market infrastructure, or by kind of sparking sector level change.
Thanks for that, Lakshmi. That's a pretty helpful perspective from the donors' viewpoint. And if I could just move on to the viewpoint from the grassroots side, and if I can ask you this question, Dipesh, I know you spend a lot of time thinking about the behavioral change that is required at the grassroots level to absorb some of this. And we were chatting about the balanced scorecard approach that you use as well. So part A of the question is, what sort of change would you like to see on the ground as you see philanthropy moving more from project-based to program-based? And secondly, do you think, is there any other sort of preparation that is required at the grassroots level to absorb such type of funding?
Hello, first of all, thank you so much, Anant, and for inviting me. And just to, I think, let the viewers know, so as Enable India, we focus on economic independence and dignity for people with disabilities. Just telling that for the context. So what is the context? I think what I believe is there are three sections. One is the social capital, the human capital, and the financial capital. I think we all know that. So sometimes I wonder, because even in this topic, basically the evolution of Rupee for Rupee, philanthropy, is it just standalone enough for the discussion? Because I think there is always a combination, because it's just a Rupee to Rupee, and then I think we probably sometimes forget the social capital versus and the human capital, which is the core of the whole crux of this, right? So I think that is a very important point. So many times I think it's interesting, but in this case, how do look at financial capital coming in? And I think Lakshmi ma'am obviously answered few things, which was, by the way, I love the state of Aadhaar reports and all that. So I think important thing is how do I blend this and how do I look at it? And I'll just quantify by the project to the program. And if you look at since we work in the disability sector, and actually, first of all, any development sector, I come from the corporate sector as well. So when I came full time as well, the first question, every discussion in funder meeting, everywhere it was kind of, the discussion was, Shanti's and Dipesh's organization will do this. XYZ's organization will work on this. right? And I can see the smiles, right? Of course, I think it feels like this person organization. So already I think the narrative, and that's why the narrative is very important to say that it's an organization, because we started and this was about 10, 11 years back. And I'm seeing this change happening, saying that this person's organization, already we are saying there is no scale possible, or there is no space for somebody else to grow into that. So I think that is an important point to make. So basically, second thing is basically in the disability sector, we started seeing even at the policy levels and funders level, sometimes money is placed. For example, if I say, I am going to give you 5,000 rupees to train one candidate with disability. Now, is that enough? Probably when you say disability, there are 21 types of disabilities. To train a person with physical disability, 5,000 may be enough. But to train a person with visual impairment, it's not. And to train a person with intellectual disabilities or autism and all that, I think that entire thing changes to a different levels. So what we say is there is diversity in disability. I think understand that kind of. So from that perspective, so if you say kind of changing from project to program, and how do I see behavior change happen when I fund it? Do I see behavior change happening in the space of visual impairment, hearing impairment, disability as a whole? What are the various factors of looking at this change happening? I think it's very, very important to look at. So the point, I think, first point to your question, to your part A, I think, Ananta, just setting up a context that it's important to look at the three circles and the intersection of social capital, human capital, and the financial capital to work this out is very, very critical for us to kind of talk about. And I think I'll tell about more about the balance scorecard. How do we do it? I can explain that maybe a little later. So,
I think that's a fair point, Dipesh. And I think quite often, investors who are more financially inclined do tend to forget about the other two circles, which are equally important. Just moving on, and I just noticed a question from Sucharita in the chat box as to whether domestic philanthropy is actually getting involved in such instruments, or is it just foreign philanthropy for now? And that actually segues into my question to Soumya, who 361 has been, I think, one of the few CSR organizations to actually explore these type of instruments for their philanthropy work. And so my question to you, Soumya, is what prompted you to adopt a blended finance approach, which I'm sure is more difficult to even justify, to regulators and internally, etc. And what are the key requisites that you think are important from a CSR perspective?
Great. Thanks, Ananta. You can still hear me clearly, correct? Yeah, great.
I can, yes.
So I'm going to break your question up into maybe two parts, right? So I'm going to start with the first part, which is what prompted us to adopt a blended finance approach. And I mean, it's needless to say, we know blended finance is an innovative way to combine or blend private, public, philanthropic capital. And it enables us to increase not just the quantum of capital available for development financing, but also allocate this capital more efficiently and effectively towards achieving development outcomes. So it drives the much needed rigor in the sector and enables a much better ROI and leverage for donors through collaboration with governments and others. So I think the rationale is quite straightforward in terms of what prompted us. But at least at 361, what used to be IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, as a company, 361 has been very, very entrepreneurial and has always innovated to maximize financial return for its wealth management clients. So for the foundation, for our 361 foundation, to maximize social return was a very natural evolution. We recognize that grants provide a unique pool of capital, which is risk tolerant, patient, and seeks no return. So by recognizing that potential early on in the game, recognizing the potential for grants to provide concessionality and bring in commercial capital came fairly naturally to us. So hence our founding philosophy was to pioneer, catalyze, participate in innovative yet CSR compliant blended finance instruments. Our goal is to deliver better outcomes and amplify impact for underserved communities through increased leverage of CSR funds. Another slight point I want to highlight on a personal note is that, as you mentioned, as Ananta mentioned, I'd spent a decade in General Electric in the US in technology before crossing over to the sector 15 years ago. And perhaps it was my years and years of Six Sigma training, but I have personally been a believer in driving efficiency and effectiveness of funds, whether philanthropic or CSR, for several years. So just a slight point I'm highlighting there is that unless you as a donor, both at an individual level, the person who's driving the change, and the organizational level, believe that blended finance is going to be good for your portfolio, I think until you're convinced as a donor, it's often, it could be difficult to champion the change. And having great partners is very key, or is a key prompt as well. In our case, Sattva, in fact, help us reimagine traditional grant giving and evolve a more catalytic approach for CSR funds to be deployed to generate a higher social return, either by unlocking capital, recycling funds, and having a very strong focus on outcomes. So essentially, we've, over the past 2 years, vetted and helped co-create. I don't want to take too much credit for the creation, so I'd say help co-create blended finance instruments, which I can get into later on in this session. But that basically maximize impact and enable a multiplier effect for every CSR contribution that we've made. Now, for the second part of your question, Ananta, which is, at an implementation level, what are the key requisites for a blended finance transaction to be CSR compliant? They're not that different. If you think outside the box, much like any other CSR project funded through a traditional grant, we need to check for Schedule 7 alignment. We need to check for CSR compliance of the implementation agency. We can, obviously have to look at how and when fund utilization occurs, and if there is any unspent, how that will be treated. And of course, that the project is not in the normal scope of our business or our company. But what is sharpened in a blended finance model is, I would say, 3 things. One is the lens through which the program is evaluated in terms of how we define, track, and report on outcomes. A traditional grant model is often your funding inputs. So regardless of whether the outcomes are achieved or not, your grant is dispersed. Whereas in the blended finance model, really looking at and understanding, and tracking, so defining, tracking, and reporting on outcomes is key. The second, I would say, is making the process and the paperwork clearly reflect the same, and make sure it's in tune with CSR laws. But more importantly, since multiple players may be involved, really defining their roles and responsibilities to deliver the solution. These need to be detailed and tracked. But other than that, it's not like there's a magic wand that needs to be waved, or there too many regulations, hurdles, or restrictions. It's pretty much just the lens through which you look at a program and define a program and report on a program outcomes that needs to be sharpened.
That's great, Soumya, and that's very helpful. Thank you so much for that. And then my next question to you is, Sarika, and you again at the grassroots level, I think you've been among the early users of such instruments, and you've successfully used such catalytic instruments in the past. What are some of your experience? What do you think are some of the key requisites from an NGO perspective that can enable this to happen?
Yeah, thank you so much for this invitation, and I must give the credit to Soumya for initiating us in this whole journey on finance. And, we work with some of the most marginalized communities who were actually pushed further deeper into poverty after the COVID, and this project was implemented exactly immediately post-COVID. So obviously it came with certain challenges, and whatever I'm like, based on my experiences, of course, as a very keen student of blended finance, as well as implementing some of the models at the grassroots level, I think some of the perspectives which are very, very critical to consider are, calculating the cost per outcome rather than cost per beneficiary. And this is kind of taking off from where Dipesh kind of, he stopped. This is so important because cost of outcome is often higher, much higher as compared to cost of beneficiary. As this is necessary, Soumya just mentioned that you look at outcomes, you report on outcomes, then cost of outcomes is very critical, and cost on outcomes can be multi-year actually, because you kind of finish the inputs and activities in year one, and actually the outcomes are only visible in year two, year three, etc. And money is required to track those outcomes. Money is required to monitor and evaluate those outcomes or report on impacts. But unfortunately, but this needs to be built into the program when we are designing the whole thing, because not all NGOs have corpus, or not all NGOs have unrestricted funds which can be actually used to report this impact. So it's very, very important that when you design a blended finance program which is multi-year, we actually look at the cost of impact rather than cost per beneficiary. Cost of impact is higher, which often deters people from looking at cost of impact. So I think this is one very, very important perspective, I think, which needs to be considered. Second, again, talking more about what Dipesh was mentioning, that while returns are important, it is encouraging to create better frameworks for measuring social impact that goes beyond the returns and includes qualitative outcomes, like, for example, improved self-esteem, confidence, dignity, etc. Because our experience is that these are the traits which would ultimately sustain any program and help break the vicious cycle and create the virtuous cycle of growth and development. While the initial funding will help, but ultimately the confidence and the self-esteem will really take you through years of and come out of that situation and move to a virtuous cycle. So it's very important to kind of create better frameworks to report on rather than just look at quantitative facts. Then also adopting an ecosystem perspective is very important, which means while benefiting the target communities groups, not only by delivering to them and solving, but also importantly solving bottlenecks and barriers that inhibit delivery of those services. Now, we work at grassroots, as I mentioned, with some of the most marginalized communities, and we face numerous challenges which are which are often intergenerational, intertwined social problems that can kind of become a serious impediment or bottleneck. So taking a holistic approach and becoming equal partners in understanding and addressing these problems is very important. Again, giving operational and financial flexibility to what NGOs need to do to get results is also very important, because moving away from micromanagement and day-to-day activities and providing strategic or troubleshooting inputs to partners. I mean, instead of asking why or why not, it will be really awesome if the question is, how will you solve this problem? Or, how will you get out of this crisis? And how can I help you get out of this crisis? So because it's very critical to have that partnership approach. And it will be important to trust and believe that NGOs who are part of this system are keen to see success as other players. We also want this model to be super successful. I mean, so having that trust is very important. And finally, building capacity of the NGOs through training and technology is, some of the perspectives I think are very critical and must be considered when designing a program around blended finance.
Thank you for that, Sarika. So for me, essentially, I think there were three takeaways from this section. One is, I think, contrary to popular perception, these things can be done. Soumya has shown us that domestic CSR can do it, despite all the paperwork and regulatory. Sarika, you've done this, so obviously at the grassroots level it can be done. Secondly, I think there's a large spectrum of things that can be done, and as Lakshmi spoke about a dual checkbook approach, there are multiple ways in which effective philanthropy can be done. And I think finally, the one mistake that donors make is just to focus on some of the financial aspects. Well, as both Dipesh and Sarika said, and you have to look at some of the other circles in place, the human sort of capital, the emotional capital, etc. Let me just move on to the second part, where I actually wanted to just get into the meat of some of these instruments. And my first question is to you, Lakshmi, who's probably best placed to answer this is, what are the exact types of blended instruments that you think really work well in the Indian context?
Sure, Nand. I think Lekha had touched upon quite a few of them in her introductory presentation. Right? But I like to think, and there are several ways in which blended finance instruments can work together. I don't even think that you can actually draw a distinction between specific instruments, because I think you have to look at it as a blended finance structure, and you could have multiple types of instruments existing in that structure. Let me give you an example. Credit guarantees or insurance, which helps mitigate risk for providing access to credit, is one type of blended finance instrument. But if we feel like the demand side, that is the people, that the recipients of the credit are not yet ready to absorb the level of credit that you want to provide, or the kind of credit that you want to provide, then it's important to then bring in complementary assistance, which can be in technical assistance or capacity building. It could also, in cases, and I'm sure Sarika will agree, that it might be about changing narratives and changing some of the social conditions that hold that capacity constraint in place. It could be, for example, when you want to lend to people who are differently abled. It could be when you want to increase penetration of credit for women-led businesses. There, it's not just building capacity and training them on bookkeeping or reporting and things like that, but actually funding efforts that hold some of those conditions, which could be very intergenerational conditions that hold it in place. And so there you will need pure play grant capital to come in. When you will need a certain type of funder to come in and provide a credit guarantee or an FLDG to the commercial lenders. So, I think when you look at what instrument to use, you really have to look at what is the problem you're trying to solve, and what all forms of capital need to be brought in to solve that. In what is probably one of the most popular forms of blended finance, which is your development impact bonds or social impact bonds, as they may be called, we know that these are very often very large scale programs. There you will have a funder who will need to come in and pay the design cost, or who might be willing to pay for the design cost. We know these are expensive. It takes a lot of effort to put these structures together. And then you might need a certain kind of funder to come in and pay for that design. You might need a funder to come in and pay for program management and monitoring and evaluation. You may need a partner to come in and capture learnings, because such a large scale initiative and such a big program, it is critical to make sure that you take these learnings and apply it to other situations. So you may need someone to come in and partner on that. Of course, you need a risk investor and you need an outcome funder. So I think it's important that you have different instruments. You have to customize it based on the needs. We've seen a very new type of instrument in recent times, which is the concept of returnable grants, where this is not a structure that works at a program level, but actually works at an individual level, where the returnable grants become a bridge between your classic grant to an individual, which might support them in skilling or social security access or things like that, where you're and it's the next step where you're able to tell them that here is a grant, and with no legal obligation to repay, but putting in a moral obligation or an incentive to repay it, because then when you are able to repay it, the money can then be rotated to support another recipient who may need some form of support. It can bring in a multiplier effect. It can start building in a behavior of repayment. So we've tried this with the Revive initiative, and we've actually seen extraordinary examples of success where we're seeing 97% repayment of returnable grants in a few cases, rates that we're not hearing about in the commercial debt space, right? So I think rather than apply a standard heuristic, it's important to look at what it is you want to solve, really look at what kind of capital, what is the quantum of different, as Soumya mentioned, it's not just what types of capital, but also what quantum, and make sure you're able to get the right allocation of different forms of capital to a particular initiative or problem that you're looking to solve.
That's great, Lakshmi, and that's really comprehensive. So interesting you spoke about returnable grants, because that was actually one of the questions I wanted to raise with Sarika as well, given that she has some experience with that. So two-part question here, Sarika. So one is, what has been your experience with returnable grants, and especially with community participation? And the second is, from my understanding, is that there is actually a wide variance in the returns that in the grants that are returned. Lakshmi spoke about an example where she had a very high percentage of grants being returned. I know you've sort of faced an example where probably only 1/3 of it got returned. So would love to get your thoughts around these two issues.
Sure. So to begin with, this again, while what type of project you are talking about, when you are implementing a returnable grants model, also I think the timing was important for us. We went to the communities immediately post COVID, and these are like marginalized communities who survive on intermittent migration. So they have no savings, they have nothing, they have no money at all. So, and when, so we went to them immediately in 2 years of COVID. So which means 2 years of zero earning. And then we go to them and say that, you have to, this is an returnable grant model, which we are bringing to you. And, this is, so honestly, we as an organization, we believe in change without charity. So all our projects in the past have been change without charity, where the community has contributed either in contributing to the overall budget of the program, or in kind, like for example, all water projects, they contribute in labor. So, which kind of takes care of almost 10 to 15% of the total cost of creating those water structures. So while we have been regularly doing this, we thought we would have a lot of challenge post-COVID, especially because the poverty deepened in the whole community. And so initially there was a little reluctance, and we went to them saying that there'll be an enrollment contribution, as in when you want to become part of the program, you have to contribute. And then there'll be some grant portion. So it was one kind of, 3 parts to the whole grant. The first part was enrollment contribution by the people beneficiaries. The second went as a grant, and the third was a returnable model. So that was how the whole thing was structured. So we obviously initially had a lot of challenges and things like that. And throughout the program, there were multiple different types of challenges that we kept on facing. But anyway, coming back to answer your question, because of our goodwill in the community, because of the trust we had built, and because we were working on water, which is the basic necessity, communities we could easily mobilize the number of people who were willing to participate in the program, in the returnable grant model. The program ultimately reached out to about 368 women beneficiaries, out of which 228 beneficiaries had contributed upfront funds. So it was like a participation contribution which they made, which reduced the total budgets, by that numbers. So it really helped us reach more number of people. So while it cannot be called returnable, but I think this is also a very interesting instrument where, they contribute some part of the total budget which is required. As a result, you can reach out to more beneficiaries. And 100% of these enrollment contribution was received by all of these 228 women. And I'm very happy to inform you that all of them continue to be in business and are thriving. So that's, the amazing numbers as far as the first cohort is concerned. Then the rest 140, we had 3 cohorts. We had agriculture, plant nursery, and vermicompost business. And all the 3 had about 20% participation fund contributed initially by the farmers, 40% grant, and 40% returnable to be returned over 2-year period. And we received 100% participation fees from all 140 people in all the 3 cohorts put together. So which was very encouraging for us, which also meant that they will take ownership for the whole program, and which also meant that the success rate will be much higher, because if you are paying upfront, which means you will return also. So, in agriculture program, I'm very happy to report, as Lakshmi mentioned, 97% success rate. So agriculture program, we have had very good success rate as far as returnable grants is concerned, 97% success rate, both in terms of amounts as well as timelines. Because both are important. When are they returning? How much are they returning? Both numbers are very important. So I would say in both the numbers, we have had a very high success rate in agriculture program. And the rest 3% is about timelines. They have intent to return. They have already returned some part of the grant, and they have intent to return. So we are hoping that we will close very soon with a very high, almost 100% success rate. I would say I'm not claiming 100% definitely, because that 3%, I'm still saying that 97%, but we are hoping to reach 100% level. The other two cohorts, vermicompost and nursery, has a lesser success rate. And with regards to timelines, not with regards to amount, because they started late. And the first installment is coming when the second installment should really come, and so on, which means there is a 3-month delay in the project completion. Instead of 2 years, we are hoping to close this project in 2 years, 3 months period. And, the return funds are now, whatever money we have already received a lot of funds. So these return funds are now deployed to go wider by covering, reaching out to more number of beneficiaries, and by going deeper, that in some cases, improving the, providing the money to improve businesses or scale up the businesses. I would say there are 3 big lessons that we have learned from this entire exercise, which I think are, which we want to again incorporate in the next blended finance program that we implement. The first is, I think when you are implementing programs like agriculture or vermicompost or plant nursery, climate change plays a humongous part, and climate change and the impacts, they are visible, and incorporating them is very important. Like this year, for example, we had extremely fierce and very long monsoon, fierce rains and very long monsoon, which had very adverse repercussions on the vermi and plant nursery business, delaying the program. As a result, when the second return should come, we are getting the first one. That's one of the reasons. The second big learning that we had was the behavior of self-sustenance through self-consumption of our communities. While we knew that they grow rice and ragi in monsoon only for self-consumption, they don't earn a single rupee from that. But we never expected them that this behavior will be seen in our program also. For example, the community, so they, as I mentioned, so what they did was, especially the vermicompost, the first production cycle was used by them to nurture their own plants, their own saplings, and things like that. And they said that we have saved money. So, saved money while is earned money, but we couldn't report on that, right? Because reporting was to be on returnable grants. So I would say, while vermicompost, the returnable grant, because that was the main KPI we were supposed to report on. So we couldn't report on that. But the production happened in time, and they used the vermicompost, and then they started selling second cycle onwards. So that's why that delay in 3 months happened. I'm not justifying my community at all, but this is the fact that we experience, which we should have built into the program at the design stage itself. So this was a learning. And I think the third learning, big learning that we have was giving flexibility to the beneficiaries. Instead of telling them that after 6 months, this much amount you have to return, after 4 months, you have to return this much amount. My big learning from this entire thing is giving them flexibility that in 2 years you have to return, because we have, what we have seen is that some people in the cohort, they were they are finishing it off early. We just want to finish off the returnable grant and just get over with it. So, while they are doing it, we are still accepting the more money that than what they are supposed to give. And there was they want to just stick to the schedule. We have 1 month to go. We are not going to give money now, while we know they have money, because, it's a very close, small knit community. So we come to know who has money, who doesn't have money, etc., etc. And finally, there are lots of laggards in the system. So kind of designing a system that incorporates all of these behaviors is very critical for success of any repayment model. But I think overall, it has been a great experience. And I'm sure incorporating all of these experiences will make it much more robust going forward. Yeah.
Well, that's really interesting, Lakshmi and Sarika, because I think, to my mind, this is one of the simpler, models that can be used, without any complicated structuring, without the need to get too many people, into the transaction. And from what you're saying, your experiences by and large seem to have been pretty good on that. And if I can just go to Soumya now, and it'll be really helpful, I think, for all of us to understand some of the use cases that you participated in. So I know you're basically focus on financial inclusion and access to finance. If you could just maybe discuss some of the instruments that work well there, and and give us some examples as well.
Great. Thanks, Ananta. So I think actually few of the points I was going to make might already have been touched upon by Lakshmi and Sarika, but that's great. In fact, Sarika, I remember what, 18 months ago, was it, when we started off the conversation about maybe a vanilla grant, and then we said, I introduced this concept of blended finance, and we said, let's take a shot. So it's
I told Soumya that I want to sleep over this because I need time to understand. And so yeah, it was interesting. Thank you, Soumya. I'm really thankful to you to introduce us.
No. So it's all, it's a learning. But I think just one point I want to touch upon before, actually 2 points before I get into the hopefully instruments beyond returnable grants. I think I want to kind of stress what Lekhya pointed out earlier and what Lakshmi also said, that it's not, blended finance is not a one-size-fits-all solution. There are very specific instances when it's a powerful tool for scale. But we always have to start with the problem that needs to be solved and the nature of capital that's required to solve that problem. And of course, like we've heard on this session, the readiness, the capability, the absorptive capacity of the implementation partner also has a role to play. As mentioned by Ananta, I'm going to kind of, at least in our thematic area, so the 361 Foundation thematically prioritizes financial inclusion and access to capital, financial access, as a lever to rebuild livelihoods. And our goal is to build necessary bridges between informal and unorganized sectors and formal sources of credit. We are hoping to nudge vulnerable and marginalized communities towards the formal lending and banking channels, mainstreaming informal workers into the organized sector. So it's important to keep this context in mind, because some of the examples I'll give you worked well in this particular context. And these are, of course, additional filter of CSR compliance is something we had to keep in mind. So the returnable grant has already been discussed twice. That works best for the most vulnerable who are completely kind of locked out of the formal economy. It's a CSR grant given kind of like a zero interest loan with a moral obligation to repay. And when it's returned, it's recycled to grant and aid other beneficiaries, other cohorts. So encouraging a savings culture. Besides Raha, we have done, I think, returnable grants now with four other or three others, so a total of 4 nonprofits. Given the time limitation, I won't get into details on each, but the cohort comprised of, as in Raha's case, tribal entrepreneurs, but we've also worked with women artisans who are part of the IKEA's bamboo chain, value chain for bamboo and banana bark fibers. We work with women artisans in Tamil Nadu. We've worked with nano and micro entrepreneurs in Rajasthan, and farmers. That's right, poultry and paddy farmers. So we've worked with 4 cohorts, different cohorts in different parts of the country for returnable grants program. In terms of the next approach, which is what I often call, it's results-based aid, pay for performance, pay for outcomes. I've heard multiple versions or avatars of this program, but of this approach. But it's essentially where the CSR only pays, or the donor only pays, if certain pre-agreed outcomes are met. We've done, and I know there's no blending of capital or unlocking of capital in this case, but essentially the working capital needs upfront have been transferred to someone else, possibly the implementation partner. So pay for outcomes is our second approach that we've worked with. We've done this, I think, with two not-for-profits, one program 2 years in a row, and then another not-for-profit in the second year. The first program was around a skilling initiative, where we dispersed the entire grant amount on achievement of placement and proof or student details with placement proof in terms of salary slips for a few months post-placement. So instead of kind of funding upfront or on training completion, we dispersed the grants on achievement of, like I said, placements and proof of placements, while retention continued to be tracked and reported for a further 6 months. That was one pay for outcomes program that we've done 2 years in a row now. The second pay for outcomes program that we've done is a program to unlock government social security schemes for marginalized citizens, where CSR or the donor pays on when the scheme has been delivered or realized by the end beneficiary. The third approach, actually, I'll combine the third and fourth. Risk guarantees, FLDGs, loss guarantees. That's kind of the third approach. And the fourth approach I was going to talk about was social success notes. So I'll combine them, but let me start with the risk guarantee or the first loss guarantee. Essentially, again, this topic has been touched upon by Lekhya and Lakshmi as well. But in a nutshell, the CSR donor is acting essentially as a guarantor and provides a risk guarantee by de-risking the investment and improving the risk return profile relative to market norms. So we have done 2 of these programs. The first one is where we funded a tech incubator for inclusive lending startups. So CSR, of course, can't fund startups directly, but the tech incubator we chose to partner with, we did a cohort where our CSR grant was given to startups, and they used that startup as a first loss guarantee to enable a credit line for inclusive lending. So that was the first program. The second program is actually a partial risk guarantee, where where our grant helped unlock concessional capital to a training partner for skill enterprise. So it was a loan that a skill enterprise could get at 6% versus market rates, because of the risk guarantee. And in the same program, we baked in the concept of a social success note. So essentially, a social success note is where the donor or the philanthropic capital acts as an outcome-based financing instrument to reduce the cost of borrowing if certain pre-agreed outcomes are met. So in the program I was just talking about, the partial risk guarantee we were doing with to unlock concessional capital for the skilling enterprise, what we said was we baked in an additional incentive or an additional in the form of a social success note, saying if there is a placement, if there is retention, so post placement, if there is a retention of over X amount, our grant can further help reduce the cost of capital. And of course, there was a sliding scale for that. So these were, besides returnable grants, pay for outcomes, risk guarantees, and social success notes are 3 other CSR compliant instruments that we've taken part in. And of course, we will always continue to explore more. What we've been looking at very eagerly is impact bonds as well. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Ananta. Ananta, I didn't get into too many details and specifics only because I know we're short of time. So I tried to just hit upon the definition of the approach and a high level example. So I hope that worked.
No, this is very helpful. So I think this gives a good bird's eye view. So thank you for that. And just we have about 12 minutes left before we get to the concluding part. I just wanted to briefly cover the social venture funds as well. And I know Dipesh has been involved with it for the disability sector. So maybe if you could just spend a couple of minutes, Dipesh, in just letting us know about your experiences with the social venture fund.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Ananta. I think one of the things which I basically, coming from corporate world, one of the things I realize is also in the development sector, the biggest challenge is thinking 30,000 feet high and having a feet on the ground. So how do you kind of manage that two together? So that is a big challenge. And when this happened, and how do you do that? At the same time, when I mentioned that we work on livelihood for people with disabilities, we also realize that there is a value chain which takes a person with disability to come to an employable stage as well. So there is a value chain of the whole system of early intervention to education to rehabilitation, and it takes a whole value chain to reach certain stage of livelihood. And for that, basically what we started doing is, obviously we cannot focus on everything, so we had to keep a focus on our livelihood part. So what we created is something called a Disability NGOs Alliance, and says here is an alliance and we'll work on a mission statement. And that mission started kind of bringing that whole change around. And for that change to happen, like I first mentioned, basically the whole social capital, human capital is one, but suddenly we hit upon the whole question of where is the financial capital? How do you see, because the grassroots NGO, many people struggle for survivals, and those challenges starts coming, and which we all know. So when that happened is where I started kind of, obviously this whole social business came up, and a social venture fund started coming in. So I started dabbling and understanding, saying that it will be fantastic to create a social venture fund, will impact and kind of invest into this social change happening from the entire value chain for people with disabilities and different disabilities as well. So it became very important. Otherwise, the whole budget, like there is a 0.04% budget in the government of India for disability. How are we going to make this complicated change happen? And obviously we need that philanthropic or some fund coming in. And this became so important. So I started dabbling, understanding the whole, understood about development fund, impact fund, a lot of, I think, these areas. But the most important thing I started seeing is, how do you invest? What is it? How do you blend it? And this is where I brought in, I used to work on something called a business balance scorecard. And in the corporate world, where your 3 layers are your organization capacity, internal processes, customer, and the last is financial. And in the corporate world, I think everything is ending about towards financial. What do you do for revenue? That's your ultimate goal. And what I realized is, in the same development sector, the ultimate goal is mission. And mission is varying for every person, every different organization, every sector we work on. So that mission is not the same. And hence there is a big divide, the whole divide between the grassroots and the 30,000 feet. Because there is revenue, the focus is basically, I understand finally it's the revenue. But for every organization, the mission is different. So how do I bring that together? So I said, maybe we need to create a NGO balance scorecard. So I did create an NGO balance scorecard for the various things, and for livelihood, for early intervention, for education. What is that balance scorecard which will make my mission or the behavior change happen? And for that, what are the various financial instruments will support? For example, is it a joint venture? Is it a development fund? It is a grant. So I think various things, and is there a partnership model? How do you kind of build out and all that? So these became very important, and I have started working on that and looking at that to see how do you create this social venture fund to make that behavior change happen, but creating a placeholder like a balance scorecard, which will actually see whether that outcomes which we are talking about, because outcomes can be plenty, but is it kind of making a difference in the life of a person with disability? Because to me, the user is in the center in this case, right? And there are different kind of users. So this became very important. And the blended models, and maybe just Anant, I'll give you one example, and very interesting example of the glasses, right? So you and me basically were visually impaired in the 12th or 13th century, because there was no assistive solution who made glasses. So there was somebody called Salvino in Italy who found out 2 convex glasses, put it on a wooden frame, and started seeing better. So this was an invention, right? From there, basically, it has gone to the fashion industry. We all know there are designer glasses. It has become a $147 billion economy. And this is happening. So what has happened, it took grant model to impact fund model to investment model to it is in the market. So I think it takes various stages. And I call this a platform. The whole model is the setup, build, operate, transfer, and sustain model. So I think many coming from IT industry, I've learned the whole build, operate, transfer. I think we have seen that in India. So I've just extended to say setup, build, operate, transfer, sustain. And setup is required where the grants are required, because you can't start expecting grant or the returning of grants will happen if you, I think if that setup is not seen clearly and all that. So that is the thought process behind social venture fund.
Thanks for that, Dipesh. So again, the takeaway for me is that there's no one size fits all. There are lots of instruments that we discussed. Returnable grant seems one of the easy ways to go about it, but I think we can look beyond that as well. There have been a few questions actually that popped up on the various models that are there. I think we discussed quite a bit of it. And again, Lekya has left her email address in the chat. So if you want any specific slides on this, do let her know. There were a few questions on basically the challenges that NGOs have with CSRs in funneling some of this. Again, Soumya did speak about some of her asks, but this, to be honest, I think it's a far bigger topic of discussion than just covering this in this panel discussion. But I think we answered most of the questions that popped up. We have about 5 minutes left. So maybe just as a conclusion, if I can ask each of the panelists to maybe just take a minute, and if you had a wish list on what needs to change in the ecosystem, it could be regulation, it could be what the other side needs to do, could be anything. I would just love to hear that, and maybe we'll just start off with Soumya. Just a minute each, please.
A minute. Okay, 3 things. Increased participation and collaboration among stakeholders, more NGOs, more donors rising to the occasion and evolving from the traditional grant mindset to blended finance. I'd say on the supply side, design of more scalable products and transactions. I think there is obviously a need for more access to knowledge and insights on key sectoral trends, impact of blended finance transactions, etc. And I guess capacity building, especially on the nonprofit side, I think an understanding of the operational and financial aspects of blended finance. But it's a win-win. I think as the complexities in the development sector continue to grow, it's critical to identify innovative solutions like the ones we've been discussing today. And there's immense potential. I think CSR has for a role to play in blended finance. Grants provide a very key source of capital that's missing in the sector. Very patient capital that expects no return. So I think using grants to enable blended finance where applicable is really a win-win. And I would hope that, well, I know it's in its infancy stages. I would hope that, and I'm confident actually, that dialogues such as these and, game changers like Satwa, Dasra, Omidyar, Raha, etc., will continue to pave the way, both on the demand side and the supply side of blended finance innovations in the sector. So thank you.
Thank you, Soumya. And Lakshmi, if I can pose the same question to you with the same 1 minute constraint.
What can I say? I think Soumya said it all. But but let me take a shot at maybe adding one more to that. I think particularly as you move towards more use of blended finance model, it's really important that we're all able to work together to shift the focus from activities and outputs to really more long-term outcomes, and of course, creating sustainable impact. For which I think we really need to have more dialogue among all stakeholders on what are the simple ways of measuring that impact and reporting that impact without making it too complicated and cumbersome and heavy on particularly the grassroots organizations that are doing the work. And this conversation can't just be among funders and alignment among funders. It needs to be among all of the participants who are working towards creating impact. So I think that's the one thing that I'm looking forward to.
Thank you. Perfect. And Sarika?
Yeah, so 3 things I think from my side. One is, of course, as Soumya said, capacity building of the grassroots level organizations about blended finance, using them, a little more understanding about the challenges that we face. And I think the second very important part is, the regulatory framework and government, involving government in creating better regulatory frameworks for blended finance to thrive is very important. Like instead of forcing us to spend all the CSR money in 1 year, we would have loved to keep some money for tracking, outcome monitoring, evaluation, etc. in year 2 and year 3, for example, but that couldn't happen because of the regulatory framework. So creating regulatory frameworks which are more, which can help blended finance to thrive is very important. And I think finally, what the point that Lakshmi had made in the beginning, that about designing a proposal is very critical to the success of any program. So creating, giving separate funding or creating some funds which will help us design, which will kind of help us incorporate all the challenges that we foresee in the future, incorporate climate change related challenges, incorporate other challenges that may crop up, and actually creating a program which can seamlessly flow from activity input to outcome and impact, So spending more time on that, spending a little bit more money on doing that baseline at the beginning instead of at the, before the program really begins, and creating that monitoring and evaluation framework which everybody agrees, and identifying KPIs at the beginning, I mean, while we do that, but it would be wonderful if we have funds and if we test those KPIs before really rolling out the program. So yeah.
Thank you. And finally, Dipesh.
Yes, thanks, Anand. So I think I just leave it with an analogy of a coin. So coin, there are two sides of a coin. One side has the national emblem, basically, and the other side has the value. So I think remembering that national emblem is basically looking at the domain, the whole side. They only see domain, I can keep seeing it. The value sometimes sees value, administrative, there is governance. So both sides are important to bring value. I think that is a very important point. And I just leave it with a sentence saying that that's what I've called it, the and effect. And it takes an and effect, this and this, to make things work in this sector. It cannot be one or the other. Thank you.
Perfect ending, Dipesh. And so thank you so much, Soumya, Sarika, Lakshmi, and Dipesh for this. Thank you to all the participants who tuned in. Thank you, Dasra. And please just stay on. I think Dasra wants to conduct a very short, brief survey at the end of this. So over to the host.